Tinnitus. It's a word we've probably all heard, and for many of us it's a sound we hear pretty often. But it's also widely misunderstood. We tend to think it's just a simple ringing in the ears, but the real story is so much deeper and honestly, way more interesting. So let's get into the real story of tinnitus, a story that begins not in the ear, but deep inside the brain.
Have you ever been sitting in a completely quiet room and all of a sudden you notice it? A high-pitched tone, maybe a low hum, or even a buzzing sound?
Yep, that's the phantom sound of tinnitus. It's a totally personal, internal experience. And if this is you, I want you to know you are far from alone. Together, we're going to explore what it is, how the brain actually creates it, and most importantly, how you can learn to manage it.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start by defining what this sound actually is. Then, we'll uncover the really surprising reason the brain makes it up in the first place. After that, we'll dig into why it can be so distressing for some people. And we'll wrap up with powerful, proven tools for taking back control.
Okay, first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what tinnitus actually is. Because it's more than just a sound. It's a very specific neurological event.
Right, that sounds a bit technical, so let's break it down. The absolute key here is that tinnitus is the perception of sound when there is no external sound causing it. It's not a hallucination like you might think of in a psychiatric sense. Your brain is hearing a real signal. It's just that the source is coming from inside your head, not from the outside world.
And get this experience is incredibly common. We're talking about studies showing anywhere from 12 to 30% of all people experience tinnitus in some form. So this isn't some rare, bizarre disorder. It's a pretty widespread part of the human experience.
And that brings us to a really critical distinction. Simply hearing the sound, that's one thing, but suffering because of it, that's something else entirely. And that's why researchers now separate the simple perception, which they call tinnitus, from the negative impact it can have, which they call tinnitus disorder. This is where it crosses a line and becomes a clinical issue. When that internal sound starts messing with your concentration, your sleep, or just your overall well-being, that's what's known as bothersome tinnitus. And that's the point where people, very understandably, start looking for solutions. This distinction is a game changer because it shifts our focus from an impossible cure for the sound itself to a very achievable goal, managing our reaction to it.
So if the sound isn't coming from outside, where on earth is it coming from? For years, everyone just pointed the finger at the ear, but now we know the real origin story is a fantastic neurological plot twist.
So what does all that science talk actually mean? Well, here's the heart of it. Tinnitus is the brain's creative response to a loss of information. When the tiny hair cells in our inner ear get damaged, from loud concerts or just the process of aging, they stop sending certain sound frequencies up to the brain. And the brain, being deprived of the input it's used to, doesn't just go quiet, it tries to fill in the blanks.
Probably the best analogy for this is phantom limb syndrome. You've heard of this, right? Someone who has lost an arm can still feel a very real itch in that missing arm. Why? Because the part of their brain that was mapped to that arm is still active, and with no real input coming in, it just starts making up its own signals. Tinnitus is the auditory version of that, a phantom sound. So this process really unfolds in a few key steps. It all starts with some damage to the inner ear, which means less stimulation is being sent up the auditory nerve. The brain notices this quiet spot and compensates by turning up its own internal activity, a process called central gain. You can think of it like turning up the volume on a stereo to hear a quiet song. And the result? The brain starts interpreting this heightened neural static as actual sound, and that phantom sensation is born. Okay, so the brain is creating a harmless phantom sound. That explains the what and the why, but it doesn't explain why for some people this sound becomes a source of intense suffering. Why do some brains start to hate it so much? To really understand that leap from just hearing a sound to actually suffering from it, researchers came up with something called the triple network model. This framework suggests that the problem isn't the tinnitus signal itself, but how three major networks in the brain start to interact with that signal. First up is the salience network. Think of this as your brain's security guard, or its threat detector. Its whole job is to scan everything happening and flag what's important or dangerous. Now, in tinnitus disorder, this network makes a mistake. It mislabels the totally neutral tinnitus signal as a threat. This triggers a fight or flight response, flooding your system with stress and making you hyper-aware of the sound.
Next up is the default mode network. This one is all about self-reflection, daydreaming, your sense of you.
When tinnitus becomes chronic and really bothersome, it can get tangled up in this network. The sound stops being something you just hear. It starts to feel like it's a part of who you are, an unavoidable part of your inner world, which makes it feel constant and inescapable.
And finally, we have the central executive network. This is your focus and concentration hub. But because the salience network is screaming emergency about the tinnitus, this network gets hijacked. So instead of focusing on your work or a book or a conversation with a friend, it's forced to constantly monitor this tinnitus threat. And that, as you can imagine, just drains your cognitive resources and makes it tough to concentrate or even get to sleep. So now we get to the most important part. Understanding all of this is powerful, but taking action is what's really empowering. So let's talk about how you can move from just being a passive listener of this sound to an active manager of your own response.
This is probably the single most important mindset shift in modern tinnitus management. Look, for this kind of tinnitus, there is no magic pill or surgery that makes the sound go away. The real goal is what's called habituation, which is just a fancy word for teaching your brain to reclassify the sound as unimportant, as boring, so that it no longer triggers that negative, stressful reaction.
To understand the #1 tool for this, sound therapy, let's use a really simple analogy. Imagine a single lit candle in a pitch-black room. It's impossible to ignore, right? The contrast is super sharp and your eyes are just drawn to it. This is exactly like your tinnitus in a silent environment.
Now imagine we flick on all the lights in that room. The candle is still there, and it's just as bright as it was before. But it no longer dominates your attention. It just kind of blends into the background. Sound therapy works on the exact same principle. It enriches your sound environment to reduce the contrast of the tinnitus, which makes it way easier for your brain to ignore.
A really practical tool you can use for this is called the Sound Plan Grid. It helps you use different kinds of sound, like environmental sounds, music, or speech, for different purposes. You might use a soothing sound, like a brook, to help you relax, or a background sound, like a fan, just to reduce the tinnitus contrast. Or you could use an interesting sound, like a great podcast, to actively pull your attention away from it.
So, what does a complete management plan look like? Well, it usually rests on a few key pillars. There's sound therapy, which we just covered. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which helps you identify and change those negative thought patterns that fuel the distress. Professional guidance from an audiologist is absolutely crucial. And for the majority of people with tinnitus who also have hearing loss, hearing aids can be a total game changer because they bring all those external sounds back into the brain.
Ultimately, managing tinnitus isn't about waging a war against the sound itself. It's about retraining your brain's attention and your emotional response. It's about recognizing that you have agency here. You may not have a volume knob for the tinnitus, but you absolutely hold the remote control for your focus and your reaction. The power isn't in silencing the sound, but in learning to change the channel.